Tulsi Gabbard never imagined that her investigation into judicial corruption would lead her to discover that House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler had been selling legal protection to the highest bidder for over a decade. When she uncovered his secret deal with Hillary Clinton to obstruct investigations and manipulate committee proceedings, she realized this wasn't just about political favoritism. It was about the systematic corruption of American justice itself. But exposing the truth would mean taking on one of the most powerful men in Congress, a man who controlled the very mechanisms designed to investigate corruption. The dirty deal she discovered would either restore faith in American justice or destroy what little remained of it. Asterisk. The encrypted hard drive that would destroy Congressman Jerry Nadler's career arrived at Tulsi Gabbard's private office through a labyrinth of intermediaries so complex that even she couldn't trace its ultimate origin. It came with no explanation, no return address, just a handwritten note in what appeared to be an elderly person's shaky script. The chairman has been bought. The price was justice itself. Asterisk. Tulsi had been conducting a quiet investigation into irregularities in House Judiciary Committee proceedings for months, following up on complaints from whistleblowers who claimed that certain high-profile investigations had been deliberately sabotaged from within. What had started as routine oversight of congressional procedures had gradually revealed a pattern of suspicious decision-making that seemed designed more to protect powerful interests than to pursue justice. The anomalies were subtle at first: witness lists that were mysteriously shortened, subpoenas that were inexplicably delayed, and hearing schedules that were modified at the last minute to prevent damaging testimony from being delivered. Most observers would have dismissed these irregularities as the normal chaos of congressional politics, but Tulsi's experience in military intelligence had taught her to recognize patterns that suggested deliberate coordination rather than random incompetence. "Ma'am, these scheduling changes aren't random," her chief of staff, Captain Sarah Chen, had reported during one of their weekly briefings. Chen was a former Army intelligence officer who had joined Tulsi's team, specifically because of her expertise in analyzing complex organizational behavior and detecting systematic deception. Every modification to committee proceedings over the past 2 years has benefited the same group of individuals, people who were facing potential criminal investigations or civil liability. The pattern was unmistakable once it was properly analyzed. Jerry Nadler, as chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, had been systematically manipulating congressional investigations to protect specific individuals from legal accountability, using his control over committee procedures to ensure that damaging evidence was never presented in public and that hostile witnesses were never given opportunities to testify. But it was the financial analysis that revealed the true scope of what appeared to be a systematic corruption operation of Dr. Marcus Rodriguez, a forensic accountant who specialized in tracking complex financial relationships between political figures and special interests, had spent weeks analyzing Nadler's campaign finances, personal investments, and family business dealings. Congressman Nadler's financial profile shows classic indicators of what we call compensation laundering, Rodriguez explained during a secure briefing in Tulsi's private office. He's receiving benefits that are too large and too consistently timed to be coincidental, but they're being routed through intermediaries and shell companies in ways that make them difficult to trace back to their original sources. The amounts involved were staggering. Over the past decade, Nadler had received approximately $23 million in campaign contributions, speaking fees, book deals, and business opportunities that appeared to be connected to his decisions as Judiciary Committee chairman. The timing of these payments corresponded exactly with his interventions to protect specific individuals from congressional investigation or criminal prosecution. But here's what's really disturbing, Rodriguez continued, showing Tulsi a complex flowchart that mapped financial relationships between Nadler and various political figures. The largest source of these payments can be traced back through multiple intermediaries to accounts that are controlled by Clinton Foundation affiliates and Hillary Clinton's personal legal defense funds. The implications were staggering. If Rodriguez's analysis was correct, then Hillary Clinton had been systematically purchasing legal protection from one of the most powerful figures in congressional law enforcement, using Nadler's position as Judiciary Committee chairman to obstruct investigations that could threaten her political career or expose her criminal activities. Now, as Tulsi examined the contents of the anonymous hard drive, she found herself looking at evidence that confirmed her worst suspicions about the scope of Nadler's corruption and its connections to the Clinton political machine. The files contained detailed records of communications between Nadler's staff and Clinton's legal team, documenting a systematic effort to coordinate committee activities with Clinton's legal strategy. There were email exchanges discussing which witnesses would be allowed to testify, which documents would be subpoenaed, and which lines of investigation would be pursued or abandoned based on their potential impact on Clinton's interests. But the most damaging evidence came in the form of audio recordings that had apparently been made during private meetings between Nadler and Clinton representatives. The conversations revealed a level of coordination that went far beyond normal political consultation, amounting to what could only be described as a conspiracy to obstruct justice through the manipulation of congressional oversight functions. "We need to make sure that the Morrison testimony never happens." Nadler's distinctive Brooklyn accent was clearly audible on one recording. "If he's allowed to present his evidence about the Foundation's financial irregularities, it could trigger a criminal investigation that we can't control through committee procedures." The response came from someone identified in the transcript as Legal Counsel C, whose voice Tulsi recognized as belonging to David Kendall, one of Hillary Clinton's longtime personal attorneys. "The Morrison problem can be handled through scheduling conflicts and procedural objections," Kendall replied. "But we need your assurance that if he does manage to testify, his most damaging allegations will be cut off through parliamentary procedures or time limitations." "Consider it done," Nadler responded, without hesitation. "Morrison will get 5 minutes maximum, and I'll make sure that his prepared statement is limited to topics that don't touch on the financial relationships you're concerned about." The recording continued for another 40 minutes, documenting a detailed discussion of how congressional oversight mechanisms could be manipulated to protect Clinton from investigation, while maintaining the appearance of legitimate committee proceedings. But it was the financial arrangements that truly revealed the criminal nature of their relationship. The recordings included explicit discussions of payments that would be made to Nadler's family business interests in exchange for his cooperation in obstructing investigations. "The usual consulting arrangement will be activated," Kendall explained at one point. "Your brother's law firm will receive a $2.5 million retainer for services related to the Foundation's compliance review, and your wife's nonprofit will get a $500,000 grant for her education initiative. These payments will be structured to appear completely legitimate while providing you with the compensation we discussed." "And the timeline?" Nadler asked. "Payments will begin within 48 hours of the Morrison hearing being canceled or successfully neutralized. Additional compensation will follow based on your continued cooperation with our defensive strategy." The recording was dated 6 months earlier, and cross-reference with congressional records showed that the Morrison hearing had indeed been canceled at the last minute due to what Nadler's office had described as scheduling conflicts and procedural complications. As Tulsi listened to recording after recording documenting similar arrangements, she began to understand that Jerry Nadler hadn't just been occasionally helping Clinton interests. He had been functioning as a paid employee of the Clinton legal defense operation, using his position as Judiciary Committee chairman to systematically obstruct congressional oversight of Clinton activities. The scope of the corruption was breathtaking, but it was the human cost that truly angered Tulsi. While Nadler had been protecting Clinton from accountability, real crimes were going unpunished. Real victims were being denied justice, and the American people were being systematically deceived about the nature of their government's oversight capabilities. Her secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message as she finished reviewing the most damaging recordings. Congresswoman Gabbard, this is Robert Morrison. I believe you've discovered information that relates to my attempted testimony about Clinton Foundation activities. I've been in hiding for 6 months after receiving death threats, but I'm ready to come forward if you can guarantee my safety. What Nadler did to protect Clinton cost lives, and the American people deserve to know the truth. Robert Morrison looked like a man who had been living in fear for months, which, as Tulsi Gabbard quickly learned, was exactly what he had been doing. When he arrived at her secure office 3 days after sending his encrypted message, he moved with the careful, paranoid awareness of someone who had learned that powerful people wanted him dead and had the resources to make his death appear accidental. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Morrison said, his voice carrying the hollow exhaustion of someone who had been running for his life. "I know what happened to other people who tried to expose Clinton Foundation activities, and I know that Jerry Nadler was instrumental in making sure their testimony never saw the light of day." Morrison was a former senior accountant for the Clinton Foundation, who had discovered evidence of massive financial fraud involving the diversion of charitable donations for personal and political use. His attempt to testify before Nadler's Judiciary Committee had been the subject of the recorded conversations that Tulsi had discovered, and his subsequent disappearance had apparently saved his life, while allowing the corruption to continue unchecked. "I had documentation proving that over $200 million in foundation funds had been systematically stolen over a 5-year period," Morrison explained, opening a briefcase that contained thousands of pages of financial records, correspondence, and what appeared to be secretly recorded conversations. The money was supposed to be used for disaster relief, educational programs, and healthcare initiatives in developing countries. Instead, it was being diverted to shell companies and offshore accounts that were controlled by Clinton family members and political associates. The evidence Morrison had assembled was comprehensive and damning, showing a pattern of systematic theft that dwarfed most corporate fraud cases. But what made his testimony particularly dangerous to Clinton interests was his insider knowledge of how the theft was being concealed through sophisticated accounting manipulation and the corruption of federal oversight mechanisms. "The key to the operation was preventing congressional investigation," Morrison continued. "Hillary Clinton's legal team understood that if federal prosecutors started looking at foundation finances, they would inevitably discover the theft and the money laundering operation that was being used to conceal it. So they made a deal with Jerry Nadler to ensure that congressional oversight would never get close enough to trigger a criminal investigation." Morrison's account of his interactions with Nadler's staff revealed the sophisticated nature of the obstruction operation. He had been repeatedly scheduled to testify, only to have his appearances canceled at the last minute due to procedural complications that seemed designed to prevent his evidence from becoming part of the congressional record. "Every time I was supposed to appear, something would go wrong," Morrison explained. "Scheduling conflicts, procedural objections, challenges to my qualifications as a witness. There was always something that prevented me from actually presenting my evidence to the committee." But it was Morrison's description of his final scheduled appearance that revealed the true extent of Nadler's corruption and his willingness to obstruct justice to protect Clinton interests. 3 days before I was supposed to testify, I received a call from someone on Nadler's staff who told me that my testimony would be limited to 5 minutes and that I would not be allowed to reference any specific financial transactions or name any individuals who might be implicated in illegal activities, Morrison recalled. Essentially, they were asking me to testify about foundation fraud without mentioning any evidence that would actually prove fraud was occurring. When Morrison had refused to accept these limitations, his testimony had been canceled entirely, and he had received warnings from anonymous sources that his safety could not be guaranteed if he continued pursuing his allegations through official channels. "That's when I realized that the congressional oversight system had been completely compromised," Morrison said. "Jerry Nadler wasn't conducting legitimate investigations. He was running interference for Clinton interests, using his position to prevent damaging information from becoming public while maintaining the appearance of congressional accountability. But the most chilling part of Morrison's story was his account of what had happened to other potential witnesses who had tried to expose Clinton Foundation activities. Dr. Patricia Wells was supposed to testify about Foundation medical programs that were taking donations for equipment and supplies that were never delivered to hospitals in Haiti, Morrison explained. She died in a car accident 2 days before her scheduled appearance. James Chen was going to present evidence about Foundation education programs that existed only on paper while the money was diverted to personal accounts. He committed suicide by hanging. Even though he had no history of depression and had been excited about finally being able to tell his story, the pattern was unmistakable and deeply disturbing. Witnesses who posed serious threats to Clinton interests were dying under suspicious circumstances, often just days before they were scheduled to provide testimony that could trigger criminal investigations. How many witnesses died or disappeared? Tulsi asked, though she dreaded the answer. That I know of personally? 11. But based on conversations I had with other Foundation employees and congressional staff members, the actual number is probably much higher. Morrison's voice grew hollow as he recounted the human cost of Nadler's obstruction operation. Every time Jerry Nadler prevented a witness from testifying or limited their ability to present evidence, he was potentially signing death warrants for people who knew too much about Clinton criminal activities. The recordings Morrison provided corroborated the audio evidence that Tulsi had already discovered, but they also revealed additional aspects of the conspiracy that showed how deeply corruption had penetrated congressional oversight mechanisms. This is Jerry Nadler coordinating directly with Hillary Clinton about which investigations would be pursued and which would be quietly dropped, Morrison said, playing an audio file that had been recorded during what appeared to be a secure phone conference. Listen to how casually they discuss manipulating congressional procedures to protect her interests. Nadler's voice was clearly audible. The Stevens investigation is getting too close to the Foundation's Haiti operations. We need to shift the focus to procedural questions about document production rather than substantive questions about where the money actually went. Hillary Clinton's response was equally damaging. Can you guarantee that Stevens won't be able to present his financial analysis? His spreadsheets show exactly how much money was diverted, and if that becomes part of the congressional record, it will trigger a federal criminal investigation that we might not be able to control. Stevens will get 30 minutes maximum, and I'll make sure that his most damaging charts and documents are excluded from the record due to authentication concerns, Nadler replied. As far as the public will know, his testimony was inconclusive and didn't provide clear evidence of wrongdoing. The conversation continued with detailed planning of how to manipulate committee procedures, limit witness testimony, and control media coverage to ensure that Clinton interests were protected while maintaining the appearance of legitimate congressional oversight. But it was the financial arrangements discussed in the recordings that provided the strongest evidence of criminal corruption. The usual payment structure will apply, Clinton was heard saying. Your family's consulting contracts will be renewed at the increased rates we discussed, and the education grants for your wife's organization will be processed within 2 weeks of the Stevens hearing being successfully managed. And if additional complications arise, Nadler asked, additional compensation will be provided based on the level of service required. We understand that these situations can be challenging, and we want to ensure that your cooperation is appropriately rewarded. As Tulsi reviewed the complete scope of evidence that Morrison had provided, she realized that she was looking at proof of the most systematic corruption of congressional oversight in American history. Jerry Nadler had essentially converted the House Judiciary Committee into a private legal defense service for Hillary Clinton, using his position to obstruct justice while receiving millions of dollars in compensation for his treachery. The question now was whether she could expose this corruption without becoming the next victim of a network that had already demonstrated its willingness to eliminate threats through any means necessary, including murder. Jerry Nadler's response to Tulsi Gabbard's investigation came with the kind of institutional authority that only a 27-year veteran of Congress could wield. Within hours of learning that she was examining his financial relationships and committee decisions, he had mobilized the full resources of the House Democratic leadership to discredit her investigation and neutralize the threat she represented to his carefully constructed corruption network. The counterattack began with a formal ethics complaint filed against Tulsi by the House Ethics Committee, alleging that she had improperly accessed classified committee documents and was conducting unauthorized investigations that violated congressional protocols. The complaint was signed by Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, giving it the kind of bipartisan credibility that made it impossible for media outlets to ignore. Congresswoman Gabbard has exceeded her authority and violated the trust of this institution by conducting fishing expeditions against fellow members without proper authorization or oversight, Nadler announced during a press conference that was carefully staged to project authority and righteous indignation. Her reckless actions threaten the integrity of congressional oversight and undermine the delicate balance of power that protects all members from partisan witch hunts. The performance was masterful, delivered with the kind of constitutional authority that had made Nadler one of the most effective committee chairmen in recent memory. He positioned himself not as a corrupt official protecting criminal interests, but as a defender of institutional integrity who was protecting Congress from dangerous precedents that could be used to harass any member who made powerful enemies. But it was his use of classified information procedures that revealed the true sophistication of his defensive strategy. Within 24 hours of Tulsi's investigation becoming known to congressional leadership, key documents and recordings that supported her allegations were reclassified at higher security levels that made them inaccessible to congressional investigators who lacked specialized clearances. The documents that Congresswoman Gabbard claims to possess were obtained through unauthorized channels and may have been altered or fabricated by hostile foreign intelligence services, Nadler explained during a closed-door briefing to the House Intelligence Committee. Releasing or acting upon such materials would compromise ongoing counterintelligence operations and could endanger American assets who are working to expose genuine foreign manipulation of our political processes. The explanation was sophisticated and plausible, turning Tulsi's evidence of corruption into potential proof of foreign interference. Nadler was essentially arguing that her investigation was itself evidence of enemy action against American institutions, making it unpatriotic to pursue allegations that threatened his position. But the most dangerous aspect of Nadler's counterattack was his use of congressional procedures to neutralize Robert Morrison as a witness before he could provide public testimony about Clinton Foundation fraud. Mr. Morrison has been determined to be a security risk whose testimony could compromise ongoing federal investigations, Nadler announced during a Judiciary Committee meeting that was conducted behind closed doors. The Justice Department has advised us that his public appearance could interfere with prosecutorial strategies that are currently being implemented to address the very concerns he claims to be raising. The explanation was carefully crafted to suggest that Morrison's allegations were already being addressed through proper law enforcement channels, making congressional investigation unnecessary and potentially counterproductive. It was a brilliant defensive maneuver that neutralized the threat Morrison represented while maintaining the appearance of institutional cooperation with legitimate oversight. When Tulsi demanded to see the Justice Department communications that Nadler claimed justified Morrison's exclusion, she was told that such documents were classified and could not be shared with members who lacked appropriate security clearances or official roles in relevant investigations. You're asking me to accept on faith that the Justice Department has advised against Morrison's testimony, but you won't show me any documentation of this alleged advice. Tulsi confronted Nadler during a heated exchange in the House cloakroom. That's not how congressional oversight is supposed to work, and it's exactly the kind of procedural manipulation that Morrison warned me you would use to protect Clinton interests. Nadler's response revealed the cold calculation that had made him such an effective protector of powerful interests for so many years. Congresswoman Gabbard, you seem to be laboring under the misapprehension that congressional oversight operates according to simple rules that can be applied uniformly regardless of context, he said, his voice carrying the patronizing tone of someone explaining complex realities to a naive colleague. The truth is that oversight requires judgment, discretion, and an understanding of how various investigations can interfere with each other if they're not properly coordinated. What you call procedural manipulation, I call responsible stewardship of constitutional prerogatives that must be exercised carefully to avoid damaging legitimate law enforcement efforts or compromising national security interests. The argument was sophisticated and difficult to counter without appearing to advocate for a reckless disregard of security considerations. Nadler was using the complexity of congressional procedures and the mystique of classified information to create justifications for decisions that served his personal interests while appearing to serve institutional ones. But it was the personal attacks that followed that revealed the desperation beneath Nadler's authoritative facade. I think the American people deserve to know why Congresswoman Gabbard is so interested in undermining congressional investigations of foreign interference in our elections. Nadler said during a television interview that was clearly designed to plant suspicions about Tulsi's motivations. Her opposition to established oversight procedures and her promotion of conspiracy theories that serve Russian propaganda objectives raise serious questions about whose interests she's really serving. The insinuation was clear and devastating. Nadler was suggesting that Tulsi's investigation of his corruption was actually evidence of her own disloyalty, that her efforts to expose his protection of Clinton interests were motivated by foreign manipulation rather than genuine concern for congressional integrity. The accusation was particularly effective because it exploited existing suspicions about Tulsi's foreign policy positions and her criticism of American military interventions. Nadler was using her record of independent thinking as evidence of potential treason, turning her greatest strength as a legislator into a vulnerability that could be used to discredit her investigation. As the week progressed, the pressure on Tulsi intensified through channels that she gradually realized were being coordinated by Nadler's allies throughout the congressional power structure. Committee assignments were mysteriously delayed. Her staff faced enhanced security reviews that prevented them from accessing important documents, and her requests for official meetings were consistently referred to lower-level staff members who lacked authority to make substantive decisions. But the most ominous development came when Robert Morrison contacted her through encrypted channels to report that he was receiving death threats that referenced specific details about his family and personal life that should have been known only to congressional security personnel. They know where my daughter goes to school, where my ex-wife works, and what route I take when I visit my elderly mother, Morrison reported during a secure phone call. These aren't random threats from internet trolls. These are people with access to law enforcement databases and surveillance capabilities. The implication was clear and terrifying. Nadler's defensive operation wasn't limited to procedural manipulation and political attacks. He was apparently willing to use intimidation and threats of violence to prevent witnesses from providing testimony that could expose his corruption. As Tulsi considered her options for responding to an escalating campaign of obstruction and intimidation, she realized that she was no longer just investigating corruption. She was fighting for the survival of congressional oversight as a meaningful check on executive and judicial power. The question now was whether she could expose Nadler's crimes before he succeeded in destroying her credibility and silencing the witnesses whose testimony could prove everything she had discovered. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Adam Schiff himself, not through cooperation or confession, but through a moment of unguarded arrogance captured by a recording device that had been hidden in his office by a whistleblower whose identity would never be revealed. The recording surfaced through the same network of intelligence community dissidents who had been monitoring congressional corruption for years, and it contained conversations that revealed not just Nadler's guilt, but the broader conspiracy that had been protecting Clinton interests through the systematic corruption of congressional oversight. Jerry's got the Gabbard situation under control. Schiff's distinctive voice was clearly audible despite the poor audio quality of the hidden recording device. She's been effectively neutralized through security reviews and procedural challenges, but we need to make sure that Morrison never gets a platform to present his evidence, because what he knows could trigger investigations that reach far beyond Clinton Foundation activities. The conversation had taken place during a private meeting between Schiff and someone identified in the transcript as Legal Counsel K, whose voice pattern analysis suggested was Mark Elias, one of the Democratic Party's most prominent election lawyers. Morrison has documentation that shows how we've been using congressional procedures to protect not just Clinton, but dozens of other high-value targets who would be vulnerable to criminal prosecution if their activities were subjected to genuine oversight, the second voice explained. If his evidence becomes public, it could expose the entire system we've built to manage problematic investigations. Then we make sure his evidence never becomes public, Schiff replied without hesitation. Jerry has the tools to prevent Morrison from testifying, and we have the resources to make sure he understands the consequences of attempting to circumvent congressional procedures. But it was the next part of the conversation that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy and its connections to the highest levels of Democratic Party leadership. Nancy's authorized us to use whatever resources are necessary to protect the oversight framework, Schiff continued, apparently referring to Speaker Nancy Pelosi. We can't allow a single investigation to unravel years of careful work to insulate our key allies from accountability. The recording continued for another hour, documenting detailed discussions of how congressional oversight had been systematically corrupted to protect Democratic Party interests, while maintaining the appearance of legitimate institutional function. When Tulsi first heard the recording, she felt a mixture of vindication and horror. She had been right about the scope of Nadler's corruption, but the conspiracy was far larger than she had imagined, involving some of the most powerful figures in congressional leadership. But it was the release strategy that made the recording truly devastating to Nadler's position. Instead of going through congressional channels that could be controlled or suppressed, the whistleblower network released the audio simultaneously through independent media outlets in 17 countries, creating an information flood that was impossible for American political institutions to contain or manage. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes of the recording's release, social media platforms were flooded with clips of Schiff and his associates casually discussing the corruption of congressional oversight. Major news networks, initially reluctant to cover allegations against such prominent figures, were forced to respond as the story dominated international coverage and online conversations. But it was Jerry Nadler's own response that ultimately sealed his fate and vindicated everything Tulsi had discovered about his systematic corruption. These recordings are fabricated disinformation designed to undermine congressional oversight at a time when our institutions are under unprecedented attack, Nadler announced during a hastily arranged press conference. The voices you hear are computer-generated deepfakes created by hostile foreign intelligence services working in coordination with domestic enemies who want to destroy American democracy. The defense was sophisticated and might have been effective if not for the technical analysis that was released simultaneously with the recordings. Independent audio experts from 3 different countries confirmed that the voices were authentic and had not been digitally manipulated, while forensic analysis of the recording device revealed metadata that placed it definitively in Schiff's office during the time frame of the conversation. More damaging was the release of corroborating evidence that proved the authenticity of the recorded conversations. Financial records showing payments to Nadler's family business interests, communication logs documenting coordination between his staff and Clinton legal representatives, and committee scheduling records that showed systematic patterns of witness exclusion and evidence suppression. The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable, Tulsi announced during a press conference that was broadcast live across multiple platforms. Jerry Nadler has been functioning as a paid employee of Clinton interests, using his position as Judiciary Committee chairman to obstruct congressional oversight and prevent damaging evidence from being presented to the American people. She systematically presented the financial evidence, the audio recordings, and Morrison's testimony, creating a narrative that was comprehensive and impossible to dismiss as partisan politics or foreign disinformation. This isn't about party loyalty or political differences, Tulsi continued. This is about the systematic corruption of congressional oversight by people who view justice as a commodity to be bought and sold rather than a principle to be upheld. The impact on public opinion was immediate and catastrophic for Nadler and his allies. Polling conducted within hours of Tulsi's presentation showed that 78% of Americans believed the corruption allegations were credible, while only 9% dismissed them as fabricated. More significantly, 71% of respondents said that Nadler's obstruction of congressional oversight disqualified him from continued service in leadership positions. But the most significant response came from within Congress itself, where members from both parties began calling for Nadler's immediate resignation and the formation of a bipartisan commission to investigate the broader corruption of oversight mechanisms. Chairman Nadler has betrayed the trust of this institution and violated his oath of office, announced Republican Judiciary Committee member Jim Jordan during a floor speech that was broadcast live. His systematic obstruction of congressional oversight represents a fundamental assault on the constitutional balance of power, and he must be removed from his position immediately. Even more damaging was the response from Democratic members who had previously supported Nadler, but now felt compelled to distance themselves from his corruption. The evidence presented by Congresswoman Gabbard is deeply troubling and demands immediate investigation, announced Democratic Judiciary Committee member Jamie Raskin. If these allegations are proven true, Chairman Nadler's actions represent a fundamental violation of congressional ethics that cannot be tolerated regardless of party affiliation. Within 72 hours of Tulsi's press conference, Speaker Pelosi announced that Nadler would be stepping down as Judiciary Committee chairman pending a full investigation of the corruption allegations. The House Ethics Committee voted unanimously to begin formal proceedings that could result in Nadler's expulsion from Congress. But perhaps the most significant development was the decision by federal prosecutors to open a criminal investigation into Nadler's financial relationships and his systematic obstruction of congressional oversight. The allegations against Congressman Nadler are serious and credible, announced Special Prosecutor David Kim during a press briefing. If proven true, they represent criminal violations of federal corruption statutes that carry significant penalties, including imprisonment. As Tulsi watched Nadler's political career collapse in real time, she reflected on how a routine investigation into congressional procedures had exposed one of the most systematic corruption schemes in American political history. But she also understood that Nadler's downfall was only the beginning. The recordings and evidence she had exposed revealed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of congressional leadership, involving people who had spent decades perfecting the art of corrupting oversight while maintaining the appearance of institutional integrity. The question now was whether American democracy could survive the revelation that its most important oversight mechanisms had been systematically corrupted by people who viewed accountability as an obstacle to be circumvented rather than a principle to be upheld. The dominoes began falling with stunning speed once Jerry Nadler's protection network collapsed. Within 48 hours of his resignation as Judiciary Committee chairman, federal investigators had executed search warrants on his offices, personal residences, and family business operations. But it was the discovery of Nadler's private communications archive that truly exposed the scope of the Clinton Protection Network and its penetration into the highest levels of American government. The archive, which Nadler had apparently maintained as insurance against potential betrayal by his co-conspirators, contained detailed records of every corrupt transaction, every obstructed investigation, and every witness who had been silenced or eliminated to protect Clinton interests. It was a comprehensive map of the most sophisticated political corruption network in American history. What we found in Nadler's files goes far beyond simple bribery or procedural manipulation. Special Prosecutor David Kim explained during a press briefing that was carried live by every major news network. This was a systematic campaign to corrupt American justice at every level, involving members of Congress, federal judges, law enforcement officials, and intelligence agencies. The files revealed that the Clinton Protection Network had been operating for over 15 years, gradually placing compromised individuals in key positions throughout the federal government, while systematically eliminating threats through a combination of financial incentives, political pressure, and, when necessary, assassination. Jerry Nadler was just one node in a much larger network, Kim continued. His role was to control congressional oversight, but there were similar operations targeting federal prosecutors, federal judges, and even intelligence agencies. The goal was to create a comprehensive shield around Clinton interests that could deflect any form of accountability while maintaining the appearance of legitimate institutional function. The most shocking revelations came from Nadler's communications with what the files referred to as asset management, a euphemistic term for the network's elimination operations. The communications showed that Nadler had been directly involved in identifying witnesses and investigators who posed threats to Clinton interests, providing detailed intelligence that was used to plan their neutralization. We have documentation showing that Nadler provided personal information, security details, and vulnerability assessments for at least 47 individuals who were subsequently killed, disappeared, or neutralized through other means, Kim announced. He wasn't just obstructing congressional oversight, he was serving as an intelligence coordinator for a murder network. But it was the revelation of Hillary Clinton's direct involvement that truly stunned the American public. The files contained encrypted communications showing that she had been personally coordinating the network's activities, making strategic decisions about which threats to eliminate and which investigations to obstruct. These aren't orders being filtered through intermediaries, Kim explained as he displayed examples of the communications. These are direct communications from Hillary Clinton to operational commanders, including Jerry Nadler, detailing specific actions to be taken against individuals who threatened her interests. One particularly damaging communication, dated 3 months earlier, showed Hillary directly ordering the elimination of a federal prosecutor who had been investigating Clinton Foundation activities. Morrison needs to be neutralized before his federal contacts can act on his information, the message read. Nadler has confirmed that congressional oversight can be managed, but we can't control federal prosecutors who operate outside congressional jurisdiction. Make it look like an accident, and make sure his files are completely destroyed. The prosecutor in question, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, had died in a car accident 2 weeks after the message was sent. Her vehicle had experienced sudden brake failure on a mountain road in Colorado, and her laptop containing Clinton Foundation investigation files had been destroyed in the resulting fire. But the most comprehensive evidence of the network's scope came from what the files referred to as the ledger, a detailed accounting of every payment, every favor, and every service provided by network members over the past decade. The ledger revealed that the Clinton Protection Network had corrupted officials at every level of the federal government, from Supreme Court justices who had received millions of dollars in speaking fees for favorable rulings, to FBI directors who had buried investigations in exchange for lucrative post-government employment opportunities. We're talking about approximately $2.3 billion in payments and benefits distributed over 10 years to protect Clinton interests, Kim announced. This represents the largest political corruption scheme in American history, involving hundreds of officials across all 3 branches of government. As federal investigators worked through the massive archive of evidence, a clearer picture emerged of how the network had operated and why it had been so effective for so long. The key was compartmentalization. Each member knew only their specific role and the immediate contacts necessary to perform their functions, while overall coordination was handled by a small group of senior operatives who reported directly to Hillary Clinton. Jerry Nadler thought he was just protecting Clinton from congressional oversight, explained Dr. Sarah Rodriguez, a criminal psychology expert who was consulting on the investigation. He didn't realize that he was part of a much larger operation that included systematic murder, money laundering, and the corruption of federal law enforcement. The compartmentalization protected the network from exposure even when individual members were compromised. But it was the revelation of the network's international connections that truly revealed its sophistication and scope. The files showed that Clinton operatives had been coordinating with intelligence agencies from multiple countries, trading American state secrets for operational support and safe haven for network members who needed to disappear. Hillary Clinton wasn't just running a domestic corruption network. Kim announced during another press briefing. She was essentially operating as an unregistered foreign agent, selling American intelligence and policy decisions to foreign governments in exchange for resources that supported her personal and political interests. The evidence included communications with Russian, Chinese, and Iranian intelligence services detailing specific information that had been provided in exchange for financial support, technical assistance, and protection for network operations. As the scope of the Clinton network's activities became clear, public reaction was swift and overwhelming. Polling showed that 87% of Americans believed Clinton should be prosecuted for treason, while 92% supported the death penalty if she was convicted of ordering the murders of American citizens. Congressional leadership from both parties called for immediate action to restore integrity to federal institutions, while international allies began distancing themselves from American intelligence, sharing pending a complete review of security protocols. But perhaps the most significant response came from the families of the network's victims, who began coming forward with their own evidence of suspicious deaths and cover-ups that had never been properly investigated. "My husband died trying to expose what he called the biggest corruption scandal in American history," said Maria Chen, widow of FBI agent Robert Chen, who had been found dead of an apparent suicide just days before he was scheduled to testify about Clinton Foundation activities. "Now, I understand why he was killed, and I want everyone responsible to face justice for what they did to him and to all the other people who died trying to tell the truth." As Tulsi Gabbard watched the Clinton network's systematic destruction unfold on television from her congressional office, she reflected on how her investigation into Jerry Nadler's procedural irregularities had ultimately exposed the most comprehensive assault on American democracy in the nation's history. The network that Hillary Clinton had built over decades was finally crumbling, but the damage it had inflicted on American institutions would take generations to repair. The question now was whether the country could rebuild its democratic safeguards in a way that would prevent such systematic corruption from emerging again, or whether the revelation of how completely their government had been compromised would destroy what little faith Americans still had in their institutions. Asterisk. The story concludes with Hillary Clinton and dozens of network members being arrested and charged with treason, murder, and corruption. Jerry Nadler receives a life sentence for his role as a key coordinator of the murder network. The Clinton Foundation is dissolved, and its assets are used to compensate victims' families. Tulsi Gabbard leads a bipartisan effort to reform congressional oversight and restore integrity to federal institutions, while the American people begin the long process of rebuilding trust in their democratic system. Asterisk